Thank you, Dave, and good morning. Your introduction mentioning the 94-year history and all reminds me of a joke in New England, in my part of the United States. There are some islands off the coast of New England, and as you know, island folk are kind of have their own character. And someone said at a funeral, a fellow died at 86 years old. He had come onto the island as an infant, and they said he wasn't a bad sort for an off-islander. More generally in New England, when somebody asks you, well, have you lived here all your life? Yeah, standard answer is, not yet. So it's a pleasure to see so many of you here staying in the room with so many alternative options available to you this morning. But let me get right to the subject with a simple statement so that if you don't agree with it or whatever, you can leave now and I won't be offended. The simple statement is, promoting international goodwill is a fundamental principle of amateur radio. Promoting international goodwill is a fundamental principle of amateur radio. In the United States, the Federal Communications Commission says right in its rules that one purpose of its rules is continuation and extension of the amateur's unique ability to enhance international goodwill. That phrase was added to the FCC rules 70 years ago, but it was already in amateur radio's DNA from the very beginning. So as Dave said, we have value in our avocation that we try as little as possible to pay attention to barriers of geography or ideology or culture or class or ethnicity or race. We are all one globally, and we have visitors here from Russia who underscore that point for us here today. So, where did it originate? Where did this notion of our being able to enhance international goodwill, where did that come from? It may have originated right here in the UK. Probably you have heard of Sir Humphrey Davy, a leading chemist of 2 centuries ago. He lived from 1778 to 1829, right at the tail end of the Age of Enlightenment, and is probably best known for having invented a miner's safety lamp called, appropriately enough, a Davy lamp. 200 years ago, miners would go into the mines carrying candles to see what they were doing, and often the open flame of the candle set off horrific methane gas explosions, and it caused the deaths of hundreds of miners. And his invention, but not perfect, it helped to reduce that carnage. My great-grandfather was a Lancashire coal miner. So for all I know, I may owe my existence to Sir Davy and his Davy lamp, Sir Humphrey. He introduced the use of electricity into the study of chemistry, and even has a connection to our world of electronics, because Michael Faraday, a name we all know, was his assistant. As president of the Royal Society, Sir Humphrey helped popularize science and was much in demand as a lecturer, especially favored, or so we are told, by the ladies. And I mean that in the sense, well, probably in both senses, but I mean it in the sense that he actually actively encouraged women to attend his science lectures. As I say, we were in the Age of Enlightenment. By now, you may be wondering, though, how this man could possibly have anything to do with our global amateur radio community. So let me offer a hypothesis, a suggestion. In 1813, Sir Humphrey went to Paris to accept a medal from Napoleon Bonaparte. He did not receive it directly from the hand of Napoleon, who was out of town busy losing the Battle of Leipzig at the time. And as you, I'm sure, will recall from history, 1813 was right in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. France and England were at war. And as you can imagine, Sir Humphrey was criticized for accepting a gift, a prize, from an enemy. And he responded, "But if the two countries or governments are at war, the men of science are not." Now, we will forgive him his sexism because 200 years ago it would have been odd had he said it any other way. But if the two countries or governments are at war, the men of science are not. He argued that men of science should, and I quote, "soften the asperities of national hostility." Now, the word asperity is not often heard these days, at least on my side of the pond. I don't know about over here. It means harshness of tone or manner. Harshness of tone or manner. And I'm sure we can all think of asperities that could use some softening today. Sir Humphrey probably was not the first to say that the pursuit of scientific inquiry ought to be kept above and apart from quarrels between nation states. But his story is a good illustration of the principle. It's a principle that took a beating in the First World War and subsequent conflicts, both hot and cold. Nevertheless, it lives on in the International Space Station and more down-to-earth endeavors in fields such as public health and food safety, and, may I be so bold as to suggest, amateur radio. Our roots as radio amateurs are planted in the fertile soil of science. The history of the RSGB itself bears witness to that. Marconi, who did, of course, much of his work here in the UK, described himself as a radio amateur. And at the earliest stages of his experiments, he certainly merited that title. On my side of the Atlantic, Hiram Percy Maxim, the founding president of the ARRL and later of the International Amateur Radio Union, the IARU, Mr. Maxim was an engineer with a broad range of scientific and technical interests in addition to radio, from acoustics to cinematography to astronomy. He brought the values of the scientific community to his roles as the president of both organizations, and as I know the early leaders of RSGB did as well. This morning I am not going to dwell on the role of science in amateur radio. If you stay for dinner, we can explore that topic together, as it's an important element in the bright future that I believe our beloved avocation has. But now I simply want to pay tribute to science as the wellspring of the community value that we hold so dear, amateur radio as an instrument of international goodwill. And it's not just a slogan. It is an essential contributor to a century of success in developing and protecting amateur radio, and continues to be to this day. International cooperation paid off soon after the First World War. In 1921, amateurs in North America and the UK collaborated to prove that signals could be sent across the Atlantic. It was a one-way transmission at the time. Soon, Leon Deloy voyaged from France to the United States to learn American techniques. And he returned home, and in November 1923, the first two-way transatlantic communication was accomplished by amateurs between my home state of Connecticut and France. Well, that was the fall of 1923. Hiram Percy Maxim formulated his vision for the IARU within weeks of that event. He realized that with the discovery of this remarkable natural phenomenon of ionospheric propagation, which was not well understood at the time, no one actually had a clear notion of how the signal had gotten from the United States to France and back. That came just a couple of years later. But he knew even then that it was essential for there to be an international organization to represent the interests of amateur radio experimenters. Otherwise, the discovery would be put entirely to the service of commercial and government interests. So he made an exploratory visit to Paris in 1924, in the spring of 1924, to meet with like-minded individuals. And in 1925, again in Paris, the IARU was born. We count April 18th, 1925, the day that the Constitution was actually formally agreed as IARU's birthday, and we mark it as World Amateur Radio Day each year today. At the time, there were only a few national organizations like the RSGB and the ARRL. Incidentally, the Wireless Institute of Australia claims to be the oldest, dating itself to 1910, and we won't quarrel with that. The initial concept of the IARU included membership by individuals who the concept was at the time. As soon as there were enough of them in a country, they would band together to form a section of the IARU, because there were so few national societies at the time. But that model was soon abandoned in favor of today's federation of national member societies with their own identity, but who are an integral part of the IARU regional and global organizations. There is an IARU member society today in nearly every country with a resident amateur population. And this week we added 2 more, Saudi Arabia and Seychelles. It's early in the day, but I'm sure I could put you back to sleep by describing the IARU organizational structure in greater detail. I could have prepared PowerPoints to emphasize the fact. Instead, I would like to talk about some of the people I have met in the 47 years I've been involved in IARU. Initially as a member of the ARRL headquarters staff, and for the past 3.5 years as the volunteer secretary of IARU globally. I began my full-time career with the ARRL in 1972, May 1972. My first assignment was to write a column for the July 1972 issue of QST, the ARRL membership journal, called IARU News. Like most amateurs, I didn't know much about the IARU at the time, but that quickly changed. The ARRL Assistant General Manager, Dick Baldwin, WNRU, was already thinking about the next World Administrative Radio Conference, or WARC as we used to be able to pronounce it, which had as yet been unscheduled, but it was coming. It was going to be a complete review of the ITU radio regulations governing the radio spectrum from DC to light, all at one conference. So he realized what needed to be done to prepare the best case for retaining and maybe, just maybe, expanding our frequency allocations. In the fall of 1974, Dick brought me along with him to Geneva for a 2-week seminar at ITU headquarters, to be followed by 2 weeks visiting several IARU member societies to talk about preparations at the national level for the conference, which ultimately became WARC 79 when it was held 5 years later. In 1974, I was 25 years old. I had never set foot outside the United States except to visit Niagara Falls, Canada. So this was a rather heady experience. Our first stop after Geneva was Zurich for a meeting with the officials of USCA, the Swiss Society, followed by a flight to Berlin, where we met the newest IARU member society at the time, the Radio Club of the German Democratic Republic. Well, we spent our day with the officials of the GDR, and in the evening, Dick went back to West Berlin, left me in East Berlin. He went off to Algeria and visits to North Africa, while I was slated to go from there to Prague, Athens, Belgrade, and Bucharest before stopping on my return trip home in London to be debriefed by Roy Stevens, G2BVM. Steve was at the time the secretary of IARU Region 1. And for me, I was instructed bypassing London was not an option. A condition of my being allowed to poke around in Steve's patch was that he be fully informed as to what I had learned on the way. In other words, I was debriefed by an expert. I hope the old timers in RSGB remember Steve as fondly as I do. He was a tireless worker for both organizations, and today the highest award that IARU Region 1 gives to an individual is in memory of Roy Stevens, G2BVM. What I learned in Prague, Belgrade, and Bucharest in particular was that my passion for amateur radio that I had felt since the age of 13 was shared by people living in circumstances quite different from my own. Some of the people I'd met had been penalized, even imprisoned for their devotion to our avocation. And it was very humbling for a naive American to see what they were achieving while having to overcome obstacles that I simply could not have imagined. Amateur radio behind what we called the Iron Curtain was not exactly as we knew it in the West, but it was certainly recognizable. There were many characteristics that were the same. And of course, we were at the time communicating regularly and with our colleagues in Eastern Europe. To this day, I have friendships that were formed on that quick tour of Eastern Europe. Other visits followed to other countries by myself and others, spreading the word of what the IARU hoped to achieve and asking for help to accomplish it. Another meeting a couple of years later was held in Monrovia, Liberia, with the IARU West Africa Conference, and that brought together 9 countries, amateurs of 9 countries in West Africa. That was an important step in building support for amateur radio there. In the end, as of course you now know, Work 79 was a great success for amateur radio. Another extraordinary gathering of leaders from all 3 IARU regions was held in Miami, actually Miami Beach, in 1976, which laid the groundwork for a team effort that resulted in retention of the traditional amateur bands against a great deal of pressure from broadcasters and others, new bands at 10, 18, and 24 megahertz, and significant improvements on 160 and 80 meters. We gained footholds in newly allocated spectrum all the way up into the millimeter wave bands that are now coveted by commercial interests looking to deploy 5G and charge their customers for those services. Without the framework of global cooperation that was provided by the IARU, none of that could have happened. Had there not been a united amateur radio community working with their national administrations to build support for amateur radio, we simply would not have even retained the allocations that we had at the time. There was a point, my wife Linda, K1ZD, is here in the audience, and I remember in 1979, Linda came over to spend some time with me in Geneva during the conference. And she asked me, well, what's going on there? And I told her, well, it's pretty boring stuff. You sit in a big room and you listen to debates back and forth. Most of it has nothing to do with amateur radio, but you have to be there. So one day she decided to come down and get a visitor's pass and sit in the gallery and listen. And she puts on the headphones and she listens for a couple of minutes and all of a sudden realizes, wait a minute, they're talking about taking away 40 meters. And actually, at that very moment, that's exactly what that particular committee was doing. So I'm not sure she trusted me after that. But she trusted me enough for us to be married for 39 years and counting. So the IARU's efforts continue today with plans, of course, for the future. Last weekend, Linda and I returned home from 10 days of meetings in Lima, Peru, in conjunction with the IARU Region 2 conference. Amateurs from 21 countries were there. Toward the end of October, several of us will arrive in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for the ITU World Radio Communication Conference, where we hope, among other things, to improve the 6-meter allocation here in Region 1. And tying back to Africa for a moment, the most favorable proposal for the 6-meter band in Region 1 comes from the Africa Telecommunications Union, which is proposing a 4 megahertz primary allocation shared with the existing services in that band in Region 1. In Europe, after a great deal of effort, a proposal that is almost as favorable is coming from the European, it's a European common proposal from CEPT that took Don, well, I know you don't want to think about how many person days of work went into that result. An important part of the work of WRC 19 is to set the agenda for WRC 23, which is in brackets. The date has not actually been established. So at Sharm el-Sheikh, we will also be trying to head off potential threats to the amateur bands, such as the French proposal for 2 meters that I'm sure many of you have heard about. It gained a lot of notoriety over the summer. And we've made a lot of progress in heading that off, but of course we won't actually know until the conference ends toward the end of November whether we're 100% successful. Those of us who work on behalf of IARU are all volunteers, but travel to places like that is both necessary and expensive. And it's your RSGB dues that help to bear the burden. So for that, I thank you. Next year, it will be Region 1's turn to hold a conference in Novi Sad, Serbia, the second city in Serbia. And your IARU Region 1 is the most active of the 3 regional organizations, with members stretching from Western Europe through Africa and all the way east to Vladivostok. Region 1 sponsors a variety of activities to promote international goodwill, including amateur radio direction finding, ARDF, and high-speed telegraphy, HST, championships. A recent addition is a group of younger amateurs within Region 1 supporting youth activities, including the Youngsters on the Air summer camp that was held here in the UK in 2017. I know that any of you who have been at ham radio in Friedrichshafen in recent years will agree with me that the exuberance of the Yota gang at ham radio is infectious. It's They have truly achieved critical mass to keep amateur radio alive in a younger generation. I must give a shout out to my friend and Region 1 President, Don Beatty, G3BJ, who was part of the contingent in Lima, who always seems to find himself at the center of whatever is most important to amateur radio at the time. Currently, that includes building our defenses against interference from a technology known as wireless transfer for electric vehicles. Under Don's leadership, the Region 1 conference next year will be making a very serious effort to plan a healthy future for amateur radio in the region. Well, before turning to any questions you might have and before sending you on your way to enjoy the rest of the convention, I do not want to leave you with the idea that the IARU claims a monopoly on promoting international goodwill through amateur radio. Amateur satellite organizations have done so for 50 years. The World Radio Sport Team Championship, WRTC, which I'll be talking about this afternoon, is about to enter its 4th decade of bringing competitively minded amateurs together. Advances in amateur digital and microwave communications are the result of international groups of enthusiasts operating informally, perhaps without formal organizations, which is often the best way forward. FOC, a UK-centric club in which I've been privileged to be a member since 1969, is another prime example. And these are just a few illustrations. I could not try to list them all without risking leaving some out. So we are indeed a global community, or if you insist, a collection of global communities. We are the way we are because of values that early amateur radio experimenters inherited from a tradition of amateur scientists who could not have imagined that such a thing as amateur radio might someday exist. And now, looking to the future, it is our turn to bequeath those values to future generations. So thank you. I look forward to conversations with many of you over the course of the weekend, and we do have, I guess, about 10 minutes for questions. Anyone? Oh, sorry. Yes, Nigel. OE5 TXF, I believe.
OE5 TXF, no less. My new EU-friendly call sign. Thank you very much. Fantastic and very interesting presentation. It gave us a fantastic sort of history view, and it was very, very enjoyable. Could I ask you a little bit about the future now? We've all learned and heard about FT8. How's this going to change the way amateur radio is going? We need less frequencies. We like FT8, some of us. It's very, very good. How's it going to change towards the future? Thank you very much.
Well, you can always count on Nigel to provide the stumper at the very beginning. Well, of course, FT8 has been around for, a bit more than 2 years, and so it's a bit early to know what its long-term effect will be. It is interesting that FT8 has so little impact on spectrum utilization, that it uses such a narrow segment of the bands. And of course, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we have to be demonstrating that we're making full use of our allocations to retain them. But of course, FT8 is overlaid on top of existing amateur activities that continue. My personal view is that while FT8 is going to remain clearly extraordinarily popular, there will, after the initial enthusiasm, the burst of enthusiasm passes, that we will get back to some other modes. And among digital communications, where you're actually concerned about transmitting data, transmitting content, transmitting, we hope, intelligence, If you're going to do that at a rate that is of interest to humans, you need a bit more bandwidth. And actually, some of the developments over the past few years in digital communications have involved using the full extent of an SSB bandwidth, 2.7 kilohertz or so, for data. And how do you pack in more data into that segment? Some would argue, I don't happen to agree with them, but some in my home country would argue that this broader band digital mode is a grave threat to amateur radio as we know it. It's going to run roughshod over the entire HF spectrum. No one will be able to get a word in edgewise because people will be sending emails to their stockbrokers and so on, which is rubbish. But that argument has been put forward, and unfortunately is impossible to beat down because the proponents of it are not operating in a rational framework. I made that observation, gosh, in 2014 in Norwich at the Norfolk Amateur Radio Society, and that was picked up on YouTube, and I was roundly criticized when I got home for having had the temerity to suggest that these people were irrational. So I repeat my words today. So Nigel, I hope that helps answer your question. Anything down in the dark corner? Yes, sir.
I've read in the last few days. Sorry. Hi, I'm Ian G3YBY. I've read in the last few days that the state of California has asked all amateur repeaters to be taken down from public transmitter sites because it's no longer seen as important for emergency communications. Do you see a threat in that? Because amateur radio has always been seen as a last resort in terms of emergency comms.
Well, I became aware of that last night when Don kindly forwarded me an email to that effect. I looked at the source of this, and I have to question question the source of the information. Now, it may well be, and I'm just simply not up to date on it, but it may well be that there has been something that has cropped up. It's an issue that crops up from time to time about private use of public land. And when I was with ARRL, we had these crop up from time to time in other states and even at the federal level. So I don't know exactly what led to this particular alarmist view. It probably has a kernel of truth to it, but as we drill down, we'll probably find that it's a bit less worrying than was originally suggested. And if it is that worrying, well, then amateurs will respond. There are over 100,000 radio amateurs in California. Yes. You don't hear the W6s over here. But you hear a lot more W1s, I know, even though there are fewer of us. But they will not be quiet about this, shall we say, if this is actually a blanket. Oh, no more amateur repeaters on public lands. We'll just have to see how that unfolds. Yes, Nick.
Nick, G3RWF. When I was first licensed, the international aspect of amateur radio was pretty obvious. Lots of people working as expatriates all over the world. I mean, Liberia, you mentioned, had lots of stations on. Times have changed. You don't find that pattern of expatriates working and using it as their means of primary communication. Would you like to say a little bit about how you maintain the international nature of amateur radio when you don't have that dimension and you're perhaps working with administrations and with different structures?
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. Well, Nick, I know that you in particular are familiar with this because you still go to countries in the former British Empire, among others. And it's true that historically, in many distant parts of the world, amateur radio was essentially the only means of instant communication back home. Think about it. The international telephone calls at the time were horrifically expensive, even if they were available, and they often were not from some places. Even telegrams were expensive and inconvenient. So a lot of people used amateur radio. I was chatting with a woman a year or so ago who told me of her family had been in northern Rhodesia, and she remembered that she had an uncle who was a radio amateur there who did precisely that. He used amateur radio to communicate back to the UK. And of course, that's all gone by the wayside. Today was one of these, and WhatsApp and so many other apps available. You can pretty well communicate around the world, video communicate with no incremental cost at all. So the need for amateur radio to do that sort of communication has certainly declined. And it's not just international. I suppose the outstanding example I can think of is the country of Colombia, Colombia spelled with 2 O's, where in 1983, when the IARU Region 2 conference was held in Cali, Colombia, there were 1,800 radio amateurs in the country. There was a network of repeaters that ran through the entire backbone of the country. And the reason that there were so many licensed radio amateurs was because it was a primary means of communication, of personal communication, among the elites in the country to stay in touch with their family members at a time when personal security was a matter of a lot of concern in the country. Well, of course, with the development of the cellular network, that need disappeared, and so did all of those amateurs. And so the National Society in Colombia, LCRA, is today a pale shadow of the organization that hosted the conference in 1983. I remember bringing several hundred IARU badges, little pins, down to the conference, and we completely ran out. There were probably 600 people who came, not all to participate in the conference, but to participate in the social activities connected to it. So yes, those are environmental realities, Nick. And tonight I will talk more about the things in the environment that we simply cannot change. We have to adapt to them. We have to recognize the challenges that they represent and do our best to respond to them. But I think, and I'll talk about it tonight, I believe we have a very good response to those challenges that we can make. One last quick question. I guess the questions are always quick. It's the answers that take forever. Well, I want to thank you all again, and look forward to talking more over the weekend.
Thank you, Dave. Sure, really.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave, for that. Excellent talk there, really interesting. I think we all need to support, we all need to support IARU. We do that through our RSGB membership, and we wish the IARU all the best in the coming weeks at the WRC.
Thank you.
I know you're going to be working your socks off, you guys, so you deserve a medal for it. Well done.
Thank you.
Cheers.